and welcome to today's webinar, Digital Preservation for Small Repositories. Would you please take a moment to enter your name and institutional affiliation into the chat box at the bottom right of your screen. And if other people are attending this webinar with you, please let us know who they are as well. And while I'm waiting for folks to do that, I just want to let you know that if any questions pop into your head at any point in this webinar, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. I'm going to stop and address questions at a couple of points, but I will keep my eye on the chat box throughout. Just to let you know who I am, I'm Bonnie Weddle. I'm the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives. I've worked with electronic records since 2004, but I've also processed a lot of paper records, created and reviewed archival descriptive tools, and helped to staff the State Archives Reference Desk. I have a Bachelor of Arts degree from the College of Worcester in Ohio and a Master of Arts in History degree from Kent State University, also in Ohio. And you will note that another one of those degrees is in computer science. As we'll see later today, archivists who work with electronic records, or a term I'm going to use, digital content, need solid archival knowledge far more than they need computer science expertise. I should also note that the cat will not be joining us today. I'm doing this webinar in the office. If I were doing it at home, there's a very good chance that she would join us at some point, but she's not here. Okay, here's the roadmap for today. We're going to start out by exploring why digital content poses such a challenge for archivists, define some key terms, and detail how to set up a simple processing computer suitable for reviewing and storing digital files. We'll then examine the activities that are at the core of digital preservation with an emphasis on how repositories that don't have a huge staff or IT budget and that haven't done a lot of digital preservation work or are just starting to do digital preservation work can address them. And throughout the day, we're going to also identify some next steps and helpful resources. I do want to say a few words about what we're not going to do today. First off, we're not going to identify any one-size-fits-all answers because in our world, they simply don't exist. For example, we all know that movable shelving can help maximize storage space. However, movable shelving isn't the right solution for every archives. If buying movable shelving would bankrupt your organization, or if your archival storage is on the second floor of a 19th century wood frame building, movable shelving isn't appropriate. With digital preservation, as with everything else, the best solution is the one that works best for your organization at this point in time. We're also not going to give in to despair. Digital preservation can seem overwhelming and confusing, but it's not rocket science, trust me. And the experiences and perspective that you developed by working with paper materials will stand you a good stead as you start working with digital content. In addition, let's keep in mind that, as is the case with paper, we're really just running a relay race. We shouldn't expect to find permanent, for all time solutions. All we need to do is keep our collections intact, undamaged, and accessible until we're ready to hand them over to our successors, at which point they become our successors' problem. We're also going to avoid some advanced topics. There's a really large body of theoretical material relating to digital preservation, and as you gain more experience and delve more deeply into digital preservation work, you will need to develop some degree of familiarity with it. However, if you're just getting started, it can be kind of overwhelming and induce despair, so we're going to stay away from it today. We're also going to stay away from file format migration, which is the process of converting files encoded in older file formats to newer, more preservation-friendly formats. This is a really huge, really important aspect of digital preservation work, but it's something that you can wait until you can wait some time to focus on until you've got some knowledge, you've got some practical experience under your belt. Today, we're going to focus much more on first steps. And I just want to take a couple of minutes to explore the currents that make digital preservation a challenge. There are indeed multiple rip currents, but we can navigate through or around them. First challenge, unlike paper records, which we can usually examine without the use of any specialized equipment or microfilm, which we can access with a light source and a simple lens, it's not possible to access digital files without some combination of hardware and software. Some files can be accessed in a variety of environments. For example, I can easily access PDF files on the Windows computer I use at work, the Mac computer I use at home, the Google Chromebook that I use when I'm traveling, and the Android phone that I just use way too much. However, other files require a very specific combination of hardware and software. For example, product design drawings and other files created with computer-assisted design software can't be fully accessed unless you have a computer that has the same operating system software and the same version of the same computer-assisted design software that was used to create the file. If you've got version 10 and the file was created in version 9, you might not be able to access it. Second challenge, we're creating ever-increasing volumes of digital information. International Data Corporation, which is a technology market research firm, estimates that by 2025, computers around the globe will store a total of 163 zettabytes of data. To put that in terms that may or may not be a little easier to understand, 163 zettabytes is equivalent to approximately 1 trillion with a T gigabytes. It's the equivalent of streaming everything in the Netflix catalog a total of 489 million times, or stuffing data onto 40 trillion DVDs. However, let's not panic. You're not going to be responsible for preserving 163 zettabytes of data. I'm not responsible for preserving 163 zettabytes of data. Later today, we're going to talk about how to zero in on the tiny smattering of data for which you are responsible. Next challenge, computer technology changes rapidly, is inherently fragile, and increasingly networked. Information technology evolves with blistering speed, and hardware and software that was once common becomes harder and harder to find and use as time progresses. For example, 15 years ago, almost every laptop and desktop computer on the market came with a built-in CD/DVD drive, and some still had built-in floppy disk drives. Now, many laptops and desktops lack CD/DVD drives, and good luck finding a computer that has an internal floppy disk drive. In addition, every type of computer media upon which we store data is inherently fragile and has an unpredictable lifespan. If you burn data onto a CD today, there's a possibility that if you care for the disk properly, you'll be able to read that CD in 20 years, assuming, of course, you find a working computer with a working CD drive. However, there's also a distinct possibility that you may not be able to read that disk 6 months from now. Another trouble spot, hardware and storage media are getting smaller and smaller, and small devices and media can easily be lost, stolen, or inadvertently destroyed. For example, we can now buy USB thumb drives that house 64 gigabytes of data, which means that it's now possible to lose 64 gigabytes of data by neglecting to take the drive out of your pocket before you do the laundry, which is something that I myself have done. We also live in an increasingly internet-connected world, which offers a host of advantages, but also exposes digital data to the risks associated with viruses, Trojan horse applications, other malware, and hackers. Finally, our information environment is increasingly decentralized, and data may be stored in multiple places and in multiple ways. Even within a small organization, data might be spread across network servers, multiple desktops and laptops, smartphones, tablets, smart devices such as HVAC control and monitoring devices, portable media such as CDs and external hard drives, and the cloud, about which I'll say a bit in a few minutes. The spread of data is made even more chaotic by the fact that the people who create the data typically don't get much guidance regarding where to store it or how to name it or organize it. As a result, each person gives files names that make sense to him or her, creates folder structures that make sense to him or her. Draft copies and duplicate copies of files are scattered everywhere, and important organizational records may find their way onto staff members' home computers or into staff members' personal email accounts. And we're going to talk a little bit later today about some strategies for minimizing this sort of chaos. Now that we've examined some of the challenges that we face, let's take a few minutes to define a few key terms. I know that this is going to be a lot of information up front, but I want to be sure that we're all on the same page for the remainder of this webinar. First, what exactly do we mean by digital preservation? I assume that you all have some idea of what it entails, or you wouldn't have signed up for this webinar, but let's explore the concept for a little bit. I really like the definition developed by the American Library Association's Working Group on Digital Preservation, which states that digital preservation is a set of policies, strategies, and actions that ensure that digital files remain accessible over the long term. What does accessible mean? It means that content is displayed accurately and that its authorship and provenance is documented comprehensively. If a given file needs to be converted to a newer format in order to remain accessible, the end result of that conversion must preserve to the greatest extent possible the appearance and functionality of the original file. The relationship of the newer file to the older file must also be documented. Second, digitized. Digitized materials are those files that are created when a paper-based document or photographic print, film-based slides, negatives, motion pictures, audio cassettes, vinyl albums, or videotapes are converted to digital format. If you use a scanner to create a digital image of a handwritten letter, you're producing digitized content. In contrast, materials that are born digital were created using hardware and software. It's certainly possible to convert born digital materials to analog format. If you've ever created a Microsoft Word document and then printed it out, that's exactly what you've done. However, many born digital files are maintained in digital format, either because it's far easier to access them in digital form, or because it's difficult or impossible to convert them to analog format. For example, if you have a database that tracks 28,000 pieces of incoming and outgoing correspondence and consists of multiple linked tables, a printout of its contents isn't going to be particularly helpful. Throughout this webinar, and you've probably already noticed, I'm going to use the term digital content a lot. This is a common catch-all term for any sort of digitized or born digital information. And I'm going to use it because many of us are responsible for caring not only for digital materials found in our collections, but also for digital publications and the digital business records our organizations create. Depending on our context, we may also have responsibility for digital artworks and other types of digital material. Digital content covers them all. Hardware. I think most of us have a sense of what hardware is, but just to review, hardware consists of the physical, mechanical, and electrical components of a computer or computer system. Basically, if you can touch it, it's hardware. Software, in contrast, is intangible, and it consists of sets of instructions that govern how the hardware works. And there are two main kinds of software. System software controls the overall operation of computers and includes operating system software such as Windows or Mac OS, and device drivers that enable printers and other devices to interact with the computers. Application software performs specific tasks, and there are many, many, many different types. And there are just a few examples up there on the screen. File formats are conventions for encoding text and other data that humans can read or see into binary form and back into human readable form. They enable software to interpret data and display it correctly. File formats may be free or open, which means that the technical specifications needed to create application software that can read, create, or edit files encoded in that format are freely accessible. From a digital preservation point of view, open formats are a good thing. If the software needed to access files encoded in a given format becomes hard to find at some point in the future, the availability of the technical specification makes it possible to create new software that can access the files. The technical specifications of proprietary formats are owned and controlled by corporations. If the corporation that owns a proprietary format goes out of business or decides that it no longer makes business sense to support the format, accessing files encoded in the format may become difficult or impossible. Needless to say, proprietary formats are not preservation friendly. The cloud. Cloud computing, there are a number of definitions of cloud computing floating out there, but simply, cloud computing refers to the practice of storing and accessing software and files on the internet instead of your desktop or laptop, or a server or storage array maintained by your own organization. If you use Gmail, Google Docs, Google Drive, or other Google services, you've used software that resides on Google servers and stored files that you've created on Google servers as well. Same with social media services such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. From a digital preservation perspective, the cloud is a potent mix of promise and peril. Owing to the economies of scale associated with cloud computing, the cloud has put sophisticated digital preservation services within the reach of organizations of relatively modest means, and it also allows organizations to store multiple copies of their important digital files in geographically distant locations. However, some cloud computing services, social media, chief among them, raises issues relating to ownership and custody of information and can add a whole new layer to the decentralization and inconsistency that I discussed a few minutes ago. And last, but by no means least, metadata. Metadata is commonly described as data about data, but I think that the definition advanced by the U.S. National Standards Organization Information standards organization is far clearer. Metadata is structured information that describes, locates, or otherwise makes it easier to retrieve, use, or manage an information resource. We archivists swim in metadata. The MARC records, finding aids, indexes, and other tools that we create to facilitate access to our collections are laden with descriptive metadata. We also record and rely upon information about copyright and access restrictions, typically within a collection or series level administrative file. When working with digital materials, we need to be aware of other types of metadata. For example, the structural metadata associated with a digital book documents the fact that the book is organized into chapters and that chapter 2 comes before chapter 3. Preservation metadata captures information that helps to document a file's integrity and helps us plan for its preservation. Preservation metadata includes fixity information, which I'm going to discuss in just a moment, when and how the file was created, and the file format or formats in which it's encoded. Okay. And before we dive into the core activities of digital preservation, I just want to take a few minutes to discussing how to create a simple digital content processing computer. Why would you want to do this? As you'll see when we begin exploring the core digital preservation activities, a processing computer can help you complete a variety of necessary tasks, including inventorying the content that's already in your possession, identifying those files that warrant long-term preservation, and possibly storing at least some of those files. Your processing computer should be reasonably new, but it doesn't have to be brand new. In fact, owing to the pace of technological change, it may make more sense to use a 3-year-old computer that has a CD/DVD drive than a brand new computer that doesn't have one. If you have a lot of portable media that your processing computer can't read, you may need to purchase a floppy disk drive, a memory card reader, or other drives and accessories. Fortunately, many of these accessories are inexpensive. For example, you can get an external 3¼ inch floppy disk drive for somewhere between $15 and $20, depending. Your processing computer should have the software needed to access widely used file formats, particularly those that are likely to be found in your collections, your organizational records. You should also have the ability to install software. Archivists who process digital content can use a wide array of software tools, but the data accessioner, which I'm going to discuss in just a moment, is very simple and very straightforward. If possible, devote your processing computer exclusively to processing your digital content and don't connect it to the internet. Doing so reduces the risk that someone using the computer to access the web or email will expose content stored on that computer to viruses and other threats. However, not every organization can afford to maintain a separate processing computer, so don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you have no choice but to use the desktop that you use for other tasks or some sort of shared computer as your processing computer, then do so. And I said I was going to say a bit more about data accessioner. Data accessioner facilitates copying of data from one location to another. It was, in fact, developed to ease the transfer of data from portable media onto hard drives, but you can also use it to move data from one hard drive to another or from one file directory location to another. It also extracts and creates metadata that supports preservation. When data accessioner copies and moves files, it applies an algorithm that calculates the total of all of the zeros and ones that comprise the file and generates an alphanumeric value associated with the file. This value, called a checksum, can be used to ensure that the file remains intact and uncorrupted or fixed over time. If you apply the same algorithm to the same file at some point in the future, you should get the same alphanumeric value. If so much as a single 0 or 1 in that file changes, the value will be dramatically different, and then you know that the file has either been altered or corrupted. Data accessioner also extracts information about the file format and file format version and the date the file was last modified. It also adds metadata identifying the archivist who copied the data and the date and time the data was copied. Lastly, you can use data accessioner to add Dublin Core metadata describing the files, but you don't have to add this metadata if you don't want to. And I realize the resulting screenshots are a little hard to see, but on the left is the input screen that appears when data accession is opened, and it allows you to add your name, the accession number, collection title, and point to the directory location where you want to store your files, and the directory location where the files are currently located. You can add processing notes, You can also add Dublin Core metadata. And on the right, you see the end result of data accessioner's work. The file is copied to a specified location on the C drive of a computer. And there's also an XML file containing all of the metadata that data accessioner extracted or created when the files were copied. And here's the metadata as it appears in the XML file. Don't worry, processing digital content doesn't mean that you're going to spend all of your time reading these metadata files. These files were meant to be read by computers, and all you need to do at this point is ensure that the XML files remain bundled with the files you've processed with data accessioner. For more information about data accessioner, including installation of use instructions, consult the additional resources handout that I've prepared. Okay. Before we move ahead, I want to stop and make sure that we're all okay so far. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. And while we're waiting for questions, let me just say a few words about the handouts. You'll see two files listed on the right-hand side of the screen between participants and chat. One of these files contains the slides you see on your screen, and the other contains information about additional resources that may be helpful to you as you start tackling digital preservation work. And I won't discuss all of them in detail today. With the exception of one link to a fake email address, which I'll point out later, all of the hyperlinks in the slide handout should be live, and all of the hyperlinks in the additional resources handout should be fine. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, so let's move on to the main event, the core activities associated with digital preservation. The 5 activities are identifying digital content that you have or will likely have in the reasonably near future, selecting the content that warrants long-term preservation, securely storing content that warrants long-term preservation, protecting your content from loss or harm, and actively managing your content over time. This is not a step-by-step process or formula. As we'll see, there's a considerable amount of overlap from one activity to another. For example, as you go through the process of identifying the content that you currently have, you'll often find yourself thinking about issues relating to selection. When you start addressing storage issues, you'll also need to think about protection, and management just kind of arches over all of these activities. It's also important to understand that all of these activities require some level of ongoing investment of attention and resources. You'll need to revisit identification and selection as new content comes in and your organization evolves, revisit storage and protection as technology and your institution's needs change, and management, as I just said, is an ongoing responsibility. You should expect to revisit all of these things from time to time. Finally, I need to give credit. Sorry about that. Credit where credit is due. These 5 activities were first articulated within the Digital Preservation and Outreach and Education curriculum developed by the Library of Congress, and I've taken a few other elements in today's webinar from this curriculum as well. However, for better or worse, I've also very much put my own stamp on it. So moving right along to identification. We basically just need to identify the digital content that you either have now or are likely going to have in the future. Why do we need to identify our digital content? As is the case with paper materials, if we don't know what we have or will likely have it in the reasonably near future, how do we assure our senior managers, our researcher communities, and other stakeholders that we're caring for our holdings properly? In addition, digital preservation requires an ongoing commitment of resources. Knowing what you have and will likely have soon is the first step toward figuring out just how extensive that resource commitment will be. Finally, not all digital content warrants long-term preservation, and knowing what you have and will likely have is the first step towards zeroing in on that content that does merit preservation. There we go. The best way to identify the digital content you have or will likely have is to conduct an inventory. Your inventory should include the born digital content in your collections, the files resulting from scanning or otherwise digitizing your paper and film-based collections, and the born digital business records your organization creates. As is the case with any inventory, consistency is a key goal. At the outset, decide how you're going to record information. When entering information about collections, for example, will the creator's name be entered in first name, last name order, or last name, first name order? Pick a convention and stick with it. You can use paper forms to gather some inventory data if that's easier for you to do, but I can't emphasize enough that you should consider setting up a spreadsheet or database to house your inventory data. Your inventory will grow and change over time, and you may want to find yourself pulling out data that documents, for example, how many CDs you found hiding amongst your paper collections. Creating a spreadsheet or database and recording information consistently makes it possible to do that. You can use Excel, Access, or any other application with which you're comfortable. On to the specifics. Your table, spreadsheet, or database should enable you to capture the following information about each piece of media or grouping of files that you have. Location where you found it, be it portable media, a desktop or network drive location, or an email account. Some pieces of portable media are housed within folders, others are maybe tossed into a box by a creator. You should document where you found each piece of media, and if you do opt to remove portable media from boxes and folders, I would suggest creating a separation sheet that documents the fact that you've removed it and indicates where the media is going to be located. Type of media, be it a floppy disk, CD or DVD, external hard drive, or some sort of device. This is one field in which consistent use of terms really pays off. Media manufacturer. This is especially important if you have any data tapes or hard drives, less so for floppy disks, CDs, DVDs, USB thumb drives, or memory cards. The label on the media, if it has one, even if it doesn't seem particularly useful. If the media ever gets separated from its collection or your dedicated media storage space, you'll be really glad you recorded the label as well as the manufacturer information. If the media has any visible damage, document it. If you think that the damage is so extensive that the media may not be readable, if, for instance, a piece of media is attached to a printout with a dozen staples, which is actually something that I saw once in a box of records that came from an agency, make note of that fact as well. Incidentally, if you come across any CDs or DVDs that aren't in any sort of protective case, consider putting them in cases, particularly if you're putting the discs back into boxes or file drawers mixed in with paper records. Finally, record any other information that may be useful. If the device or media has a serial number, record it. I would say this is particularly important for desktop computers and portable hard drives. I've known other people who've had to go into archives that have suffered major disasters and discovered that first responders pulled all of the desktop computers off of people's desks and put them in a corner of a room. And then they had to go through and sort out which computer was assigned to which person or used for which task, which ones contained important data, which one didn't. If you've got the serial numbers, that can be incredibly helpful. You may also want to note whether the media or files it contains are mentioned in a MARC record or finding aid. And if you have any knowledge about the creator's record-keeping practices, having this information might be helpful at some point in the future. For example, if the creator saved older Mac files onto an IBM formatted floppy disk, you might need to use a Mac computer to access those files, even though the disk is formatted for IBM. If you set up a processing computer, you can use Data Accessioner to analyze the contents of portable media and network drive locations, all while copying the data off the media and onto the C drive of your processing computer or some sort of network drive. Data Accessioner will allow you to identify file formats and file format types, the number and total size of the files, dates of last modification, and the date you copied the files using Data Accessioner. If you know when the files first arrived at your institution, include that date in your inventory as well. If a given piece of media isn't readable, document that fact in your inventory, but don't discard the media unless, of course, somebody has driven a dozen staples through it. You may be able to read that media with a different computer. For your organization's business records, you should also document the creator, not only the creator, but the person or unit who's currently responsible for the records, and any information about estimated future growth. If no one can answer questions about future growth, copying older records via Data Accessioner may enable you to make a rough estimate. Once you're done with your inventory, at least for the time being, take a little time to analyze the results. Did you find anything surprising? Were you expecting to find things that you didn't find? Can your inventory help you make educated guesses about digital content that's likely to come your way? Did you find anything that you know for a fact that you're required to keep, either because of your organization's legal obligations, because it's obviously of compelling interest to researchers, or because a generous donor would question your competence if you lost it? Lastly, did you find anything that obviously requires some sort of further review? And those last two questions bring us to the next core activity, selection. Why do we select content for preservation? Can't we just preserve everything? No. A single hard drive may cost only $100, but keep in mind that 1 hour of IT support time may also cost you $100. And technological obsolescence and instability will force us to replace our hardware, software, and storage media at regular intervals. If we're not selective about what we preserve, we're going to end up wasting a ton of money, time, and effort. And we archivists have known for a very long time that not all content warrants long-term preservation. It's why we appraise organizational records and personal papers for their informational content and enduring value to our stakeholders. We don't accept every scrap of paper that people want to send our way, and we shouldn't start accepting every digital file that they want to send our way. In addition, remember that I said that you're not on the hook for preserving all 163 zettabytes of data? Selection enables you to zero in on that content that A, warrants preservation, and B, that you are responsible for preserving. I should note that this drawing is not to scale. If it were, the dots representing the content you could preserve, and the content you must preserve would not be visible to the naked eye. When determining which digital content you should preserve, always keep in mind your organization's mission statement. On screen, you will see one such statement, and I deliberately chose a non-New York example. I didn't want to pick on anybody. So this statement is pulled from the collection development policy of the Boynton Beach City Archives and Local History Collection, which is part of the Boynton Beach City Public Library in Florida. This policy specifies that the City Archives and Local History Collection collects materials that document the social, economic, and political development of Boynton Beach, Palm Beach County, and the state of Florida. What does this mean? It means that the City Archives and Local History Collection doesn't acquire materials that document the history of localities in New York or the state of New York, no matter how fascinating they might be. And if its archivist discovers that a predecessor took in materials that don't relate in any way to Boynton Beach, Palm Beach County, or the state of Florida, he or she will strive to rehome them at a more appropriate repository. And this sort of winnowing down should be undertaken for born digital materials, just as it is with any other types of collections. If your repository doesn't have a mission statement or a collection development policy that defines the geographic areas, subjects, chronological periods, and types of media you aim to add to your collection, DHPSNY offers webinars, in-person workshops, and other resources that will help you create these essential documents. Other criteria to keep in mind: appeal and interest. If you know that the content isn't of interest or use to your organization, its researchers, or other key stakeholders, why would you keep it? Born digital versus digitized. Generally speaking, if content is born digital, it warrants more attention and care than digitized content. Losing digitized content can be a real pain, but most often you can rescan the originals. Born digital content that can't easily be converted to analog format, but which otherwise warrants preservation, deserves special attention, as does digitized content that reduces originals that are rapidly deteriorating. Uniqueness. If it's not unique, you probably don't want to preserve it. There may be exceptions. For instance, my own repository preserves some digital files documenting the state's response to September 11th, even though the Library of Congress also has copies of some of these files. However, if you find Rolling Stones albums, Star Wars movies, or Stephen King ebooks, or other commercially produced content, why would you devote your scarce resources to preserving them? Completeness. If Creator A offers you 7 files relating to a neighborhood association, but you know that Creator B has several gigabytes of data, of files that document the association's history and activities, focus your efforts on Creator B, not Creator A. Manageability. If a creator offers you a huge, complex collection of born digital files that will be of compelling interest to researchers, but you know that your organization will never have the resources needed to process it, preserve it, and make it accessible, work with your creator to find a more suitable home for that collection. Access. If you can't make content accessible for a set period of time, or legal restrictions compel you to withhold a few snippets of data here and there, that's one thing. If it's commercially produced copyright that you can't produce, commercially produced content that you can't make accessible without violating copyright or other laws, that's another thing entirely. Legal obligations. Are there business records that your organization is legally required to keep? Are there any laws governing retention of any of the content in your collections? Are there any organizational bylaws that affect you as well? Finally, consequences of loss. Have you identified any organizational records that, if lost, would make it difficult or impossible for your organization to operate effectively? Would the loss of any of the digital content in your holdings do substantial damage to your organization's reputation? Be sure to document your criteria in your collection development policy or in a separate document, then focus on implementation. Review your inventory of digital content and dispose of any content that doesn't meet your criteria, either by discarding it or offering it to a more suitable repository. Think too about what's likely to come your way and be prepared to say no if someone offers you content that doesn't meet your criteria. In practical terms, let's see what this means. Let's take another look at the Boynton Beach City Library Archives and Local History Collections Development Policy. This particular institution actually maintains two separate collections, the Floridiana Collection and the Archives and Local History Collection. And the organization will accept DVD into the Floridiana Collection, DVDs that depict local or Florida history, but notes that commercially available movies or documentaries are generally not collected. They've given themselves a bit of an out here. If they find a compelling reason to keep a commercially produced item, they will take it. The Archives and Local History Collection collects materials in a variety of formats, including but not limited to a long list of analog materials. The statement makes it plain that analog materials are the primary collecting focus, but the repository is also reserving the right to collect digital materials that otherwise meet its selection criteria. You don't see it on screen here, but elsewhere within this policy, one of the other criteria that the Boynton Beach City Library Archives and Local History Collection uses is permanence of format. So you can kind of tell they're leaning against collecting digital materials, at least at this point in time. And if you go through the identification and selection process and start thinking about resources and decide that, maybe we're just not quite ready yet, that's an appropriate stance to take. It's one to revisit, but it's appropriate. I'm just going to stop here for a moment and see if anybody has any questions before we move on. I can see somebody is typing. Okay, Dina is asking the order of these two activities. Wouldn't you first appraise potential materials and then be in a position to identify what you have in your holdings, possibly through a retrospective survey? As I said, there's no set order to these things. A lot of people start out with inventorying what they've already got in their possession, simply because the stuff is already there. Before they start focusing on appraising new materials, they just kind of want to get a handle on what they've got, what's snuck in various boxes of paper collections. But you're certainly free to appraise potential materials first. Whatever makes the most sense for you. Did that answer your question? Yeah, there's no set order to these activities. As I said, some people prefer to just figure out what they've already got lurking in boxes and dealing with their organizational records. Other people want to really focus on, what's trying to come in through the door and then deal with what's already made its way in. Okay, I can see one other person is typing. Okay. I'm actually going to move ahead in the interest of time. Oh, okay, there we go. Do we use a donor form for our digital collections? take in theses in the donor form, which includes the software with which it was written, version date, etc. Most papers are donated in Word and PDF format, but we're having trouble with the software that's proprietary. We don't actually use a donor form. We do have a memorandum of transfer agreement, and it does contain some skeletal information about materials in digital form. We try to supplement that with conversations with agencies that transfer materials to us. And then we do document that internally. There are organizations that have very complex submission agreements specifying formats, metadata, so on and so forth. If you can do that, that's a beautiful thing. I see you're taking in theses. There are some libraries that, academic libraries, that take in theses encoded only in certain versions of certain formats, and are pretty successful in doing that because they've gotten their institutions to agree that if a given student doesn't adhere to those requirements, that student doesn't get his or her degree. Yeah, there's a consortium of academic libraries in Florida that has done a lot of work in this area, and I would be happy to send that information to you after the webinar ends. Okay. So moving on to storage. Okay, there are 4 key considerations, the first of which, how are you going to organize it, centers largely around your own digital business records. What and where you're going to store it concern both the digital content in your collections and your business records, as does how many copies do you need. At the very start of this webinar, we identified decentralization and inconsistency as one of the challenges of the digital world. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to discuss some strategies for imposing some order, at least in your very tiny corner of that world. First off, develop some conventions for how you and your colleagues name the digital files and folders you create. Keep the names short and descriptive, minimize repetition, and use patterns and date conventions consistently. You can use any date format you want, just pick one and stick with it. Clearly label drafts and revisions, and avoid the use of special characters, which have particular meanings in some operating systems and may make it difficult or impossible to access the files in the future. If you're digitizing analog materials in your collections, create a file naming convention that makes it easy for you to tie the digitized content with the paper originals. For instance, the last quote-unquote good file name on your screen is that of the digital images of typewriters on shelves that you just saw. And what it means is New York State Archives, accretion number A3045-78, negative number 8678. The North Carolina State Archives has a really nice online tutorial on file naming conventions, and you'll find a link to North Carolina's online training resources in the additional resources handout. In terms of organizing material, try to store related content in the same place. If your organization has a network drive, encourage your colleagues to store important files on the network drive and not on the hard drives of their laptops or desktops. Keep the folder hierarchy as flat as possible. If your colleagues have to navigate through 17 subfolders to save the files they create, they're not going to do it. And try to work with them to develop a folder hierarchy that works for everybody. Periodically get rid of rescued or recovered documents, empty file folders, temp files, and other obvious junk. Try to work with your colleagues to develop some best practices about discarding draft and duplicate copies, and determine how you're going to handle instances in which, for example, you have copies of a file encoded in Microsoft Word and the very same file encoded in PDF formats. To make life easier in the long run, you should also try to create files and formats that are preservation friendly. Such formats are typically free or open, non-proprietary, widely used, and can be accessed and edited with multiple software applications. Just to give you a few examples, there's a huge, long theoretical debate about whether the Microsoft Office formats are truly open, but I think that owing to the extent of technical documentation that Microsoft has put out and the sheer fact of their ubiquity, you're reasonably safe using Microsoft Office formats. If you're doing a lot of customization and access, that might be problematic as you move Access databases forward, but you should the Office formats, I think, are generally fine. PDF, and in particular PDF-A, the PDF format developed specifically for long-term preservation, are good bets for board minutes and other textual documents that won't be edited after they're finalized. And of course, TIFF, which is almost open, and JPEG 2000, which is fully open, as well as PDFA are possible options for image files. Document your file naming, folder organization, and file format decisions in writing, and train your colleagues in their use. Depending on the size of your repository, you might also opt to do some in-person training sessions, provide some one-on-one advice, or if you're in an academic institution that has record management responsibilities, create some online resources. If you're a lone arranger, or if you're thinking that there's no way that your executive director will ever change his or her file naming and file organizing practices, you can at least be sure that you're naming files clearly and consistently, organizing them logically, and using preservation-friendly formats. Your successor will thank you. Moving ahead to where and how to store that digital content that you seek to preserve, I want to emphasize that archival storage isn't the same thing as backup copies. A lot of people just assume that, oh, IT is backing up everything and that they don't have to worry about storage. However, backup copies are typically produced with proprietary software, and it may be difficult to retrieve individual files. In addition, overwriting older backup copies with newer backup copies is a common practice. If something bad happens to your files and you don't discover it right away, you might find that IT doesn't have any backup copies that contained intact copies of the affected files. Archival storage may house any kind of content, and it has to house both the content you seek to preserve and the metadata related to that object. For example, the files you copy via data accessioner and the XML file of metadata that data accessioner generates. In addition, archival storage involves keeping at least 2 copies of the content in 2 separate places to reduce the risk of loss. There are lots of options for archival storage. If you commit to maintaining your own storage, you're responsible for managing all of the hardware and software. And local storage may be as simple as the C drive of your processing computer and some network drive space, plus a second copy on portable media, or as complex as a mammoth array of servers and network attached storage that houses multiple copies of multiple terabytes of data in multiple locations. Other possibilities, particularly for academic institutions, include institutional partnerships such as the Meta Archive Cooperative, and for all types of repositories, cloud services such as Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. Finally, there are full-fledged digital preservation subscription services such as Archives Direct and Preservica. Both offer cloud-based options that give you access to sophisticated processing and storage and free you from the obligation of having to maintain your own hardware and software. There is no one-size-fits-all storage solution. Factors that shape your decision include the number of files you have, the number of copies you need, the costs associated with different types of storage media, your organization's budget, and the amount of IT's expertise that's available to you, and any legal restrictions or organizational bylaws that specify where and how you need to store your records. As I said a few minutes ago, archival storage involves creating multiple copies. At a minimum, create 2 copies and keep one's copy off-site. I can't tell you how many times I've visited a local government or historical records repository and seen the portable media housing the second copy of a set of records sitting right next to the computer that houses the first copy of those records. If any of these organizations ever experience a fire or flood, there's a very good chance that both copies are going to be lost. Keep the second copy as far away from the first one as you possibly can. Also keep in mind that what you're doing is picking the option that works best for you at this time, and that solutions that work for you today likely won't work for you in 3 to 10 years. Your circumstances are going to change, and technology is going to change as well. When you're thinking about storage, issues relating to protection of your content will also come to the fore. So what exactly are we trying to protect? We want to protect our hardware and other equipment, and we definitely want to protect our digital content. If we've been digitizing a lot of our analog holdings, we don't want to have to redo all of that work. If we have any sensitive or legally restricted information found within our digital content, social security numbers, healthcare records, so on and so forth, we also need to protect that from unauthorized access. We also need to think about protecting our reputations. Preserving content of enduring value is a mission-critical endeavor for us. It's what archives do. And losing important digital content may cause our board members, researcher community, deans, provosts, other key stakeholders to question our competence. Take some time to think about the various risks to which your digital content may be exposed and incorporate the results of your analysis into your disaster response plan. If you don't have a disaster response plan, DHPSNY has some resources that can help you begin creating one. In terms of practical steps you can take to protect your content, keep multiple copies in multiple locations, know where your content is located, whether it's on-site or somewhere else, and whether it's accessible via the internet or not. Know who can access your content, what can be accessed only by archive staff, what can be accessed by all staff, what's accessible to the public. Know who can access sensitive or legally restricted information. If you have content that does contain sensitive or restricted information, can you password protect it? If you do protect it with a password, however, make sure that a colleague or successor will be able to recover that password if something happens to you. Keep hardware and portable media away from known hazards in your buildings. If you wouldn't keep paper records in a given location, don't keep hardware or storage media there either. Identify those organizational records that are critical to your repository's operations, digital content in your holdings that would cause embarrassment if lost, and born digital records and digital content that can't be digitized content that can't be recreated easily, and make sure that these materials receive special layers of protection. It may be more than 2 copies. It may be that some of that material, goes on the network drive as opposed to the C drive of your processing computer. Finally, make sure that your colleagues are aware of issues and procedures related to sensitive and restricted content, known hazards in your building, and that they conduct themselves accordingly. The last activity, management, arches over the other 4, and it never really ends. Assessment and planning are at the heart of the management activity, and they enable you to analyze your repository's current situation and figure out where your repository should be headed. Management focuses on 3 things: staff development, digital preservation program development, and technology development. Digital preservation doesn't happen without staff knowledge and skill, and it's important to keep asking what skills your organization currently has, determining which skills you need to develop, and figuring out how to develop these skills. If you're a lone arranger, you might be asking these questions of yourself. If you supervise other people, you'll be asking them not only about yourself, but about the people who report to you. And I just want to emphasize that digital preservation work involves a wide array of skills, and they're not all technical. The National Digital Stewardship Alliance, a membership group of individuals and organizations committed to preserving digital content, periodically asks its members to identify the skills and resources needed for effective digital preservation and for good, what makes a good digital preservation manager. On the screen, you see the qualities that NDSA members thought that effective digital preservation managers should possess: knowledge of digital preservation standards and best practices. Technical abilities and professional digital preservation experience appear near the top of the list, but so do communication skills, analytical skills, and the ability to plan and manage projects successfully. NDSA members also see passion for digital work as a result, digital preservation work as a must. If you have a degree of interest and passion, you can acquire all of those other, most, if not all of those other skills you need. If you supervise people and you have a subordinate who expresses sustained interest in digital preservation, figure out how to support that person as he or she learns more. If you're a lone arranger or work in an institution that operates with a very tight budget, it can be really hard to find the time and resources needed to develop new skills. However, try to carve out a little time to do so. It's really important that we all grow and evolve in our jobs. Doing so helps burnout. It ensures that we're able to keep contributing to our institutions and to our professions. Your additional resources handout highlights some key theoretical readings and will point you to some no-cost online tutorials and organizations that regularly offer free digital preservation webinars. And if you're a supervisor or manager, try to create an environment in which staff are expected to expand their skills and provide as much support as you can. If you can't fund a subordinate's attendance at an in-person digital preservation workshop, can you at least enable him or her to spend a day out of the office without charging vacation or personal leave time? And I just want to say, you will not find it listed in your additional resources handout simply because it's not done yet. But the Council of State Archivists is zeroing in on releasing online recordings that are also based on the Library of Congress digital preservation, outreach, and education curriculum. And I happen to know this because I had the subcommittee that's responsible for reviewing those recordings. They're going to have to go through a couple of other stages of review, but they deal in much greater depth and technical sophistication with some of the activities that I'm just providing a basic introduction to today. So keep an eye out. And those of us who are developing those recordings are aware that this is going to be yes, it's for the State Archives community, but this is going to be of much broader interest to the archival profession as well. We hope to have those recordings up sometime this summer. Okay. So moving on to program development. We've already discussed the importance of incorporating digital content into your collection development policy and disaster response plan. I'm not going to belabor those points. However, I do just want to point out that if your organization has a records retention policy, digital content should be incorporated into this policy. In addition, you need to start thinking of how to make senior management aware of the importance of preserving digital content and the ongoing resource implications. This may be an ongoing discussion, but the results of all the assessment and planning work and inventorying work that you've been doing provide a good foundation for starting the conversation. You also need to think about what you're going to do once you've completed your inventory, selected digital content for preservation, and begun addressing issues related to storage and management. As I said earlier, there's a big body of theoretical literature relating to digital preservation and the characteristics of effective digital repositories, and all of this literature can really help seasoned digital archivists determine where they and their repositories should be headed. However, if you don't have a lot of experience, it's easy to get bogged down in the literature, and I would recommend using the levels of preservation developed by the National Digital Stewardship Alliance as kind of a roadmap. Levels of preservation is a tiered set of recommendations for building digital preservation capacity, and it addresses storage and geographic location and file fixity and data integrity, which are the two categories that you see on your screen, and information security, metadata, and file formats, which you don't. Level 1 activities are all relatively basic, and I have to say that if you use data accessioner to copy the content that you need to preserve to some sort of dedicated storage and to generate fixity and other metadata, but begin addressing issues surrounding access to sensitive or restricted information, store one copy of your data on-site and one copy off-site, and provide your colleagues with at least some file format and file organization advice, you will have hit level 1 in every single area on the chart. And once you have reached level 1, you can start looking at what you need to do to get to level 2. You may need to accept that you will never reach level 4 in all areas. You know, my own repository has been preserving digital content for decades, and we're at level 4 in a couple of areas, level 3 in a couple of others, and in the 5th category, we're in this bizarre situation in which we've addressed everything in level 3, but there's one item in level 2 that we don't do. So technically, we're at level 1. If you're short on staff and resources, your repository may stay at level 1 in all areas for a really, really long time. And keep in mind that staying at level 1 is far, far preferable to doing absolutely nothing. We covered the essential technology planning points in the storage session, but I just want to say that the questions on the slide are questions that you need to keep in mind. I would also encourage you to remain abreast of changes in technology and of what other archives are doing. 10 years ago, cloud-based storage and cloud-based digital preservation services really weren't an option. Now they are, and the prices are pretty steadily coming down. You know, a digital preservation service might not be an option for your repository now, but in 5 years or 10 years, things might be very different. And I'm willing to bet that in 10 years, we're going to have access to new services and new technologies that just aren't on anyone's radar screen today. So, time to wrap things up. I wanted to leave lots of time for questions. I'm glad that we do. So what do you do when you've finished identifying the content you have or will have, selecting the content that warrants preservation, storing that content, protecting it from loss of harm, and ensuring that you have the institutional capacity needed to manage it over the long term? You keep doing these things, not constantly, but as your needs dictate and your circumstances change. And with that, it is time for questions. I purposely kept things really simple today, but I realize that some folks on the webinar might be dealing with some rather specific situations. I didn't touch extensively on the subject of email, simply because the answers are so dependent not only on what you're using, but what kind of email service you're using, whether it's something that's maintained locally or in the cloud. If you're dealing with the account of, an executive director who's currently in place, or trying to recover data from, the mailbox of an executive director who left a long time ago, all kinds of complicated variables. So if anybody has any questions about today's webinar or anything else related to digital preservation, have at it. Do you have a resource or know of the best format for video preservation? In terms of best format, it really depends on the original. If you're trying to preserve a Star Wars movie, if you're the Disney archivist, that's one thing. If you're, trying to preserve something that somebody shot on their cell phone, that's another. The best resource I would recommend is a resource maintained by the Library of Congress. They have a lot of file format information. And if you go to digitalpreservation.gov, that's kind of an entry point for it. And I'm forgetting the acronym now, but there are also, there's a group of federal agencies that came up with a collaborative set of digitization standards, and they did quite a bit of work with video. Okay. And Ellen is asking, recommend how to take pictures of something correctly so they can be stored and allow people to see them rather than use the original book or document. So Ellen, you're basically asking about digitization. And that's a really variable question. It depends on the materials. If it's something that's really fragile, that's, one one thing. If it's something that's relatively recent and in very good shape, something that you can put on a flatbed scanner, that's another. I will tell you that for most documents, and I have to say, I'm not extensively involved with the State Archives digitization program, but I do know for most things we use flatbed scanners, and our default scan is TIFF format. Okay, TIFF format 300 DPI. And if you go to the State Archives website and search for imaging guidelines, we have imaging guidelines for state agencies and local governments. They concern mostly business records, but there is a section in there on scanning materials of enduring historical value. 1720 Journal from a Store. So you might be able to put that on a flatbed scanner, but I would say, TIFF format 300 DPI at a minimum. And you can always produce an access copy that you can put on the web in JPEG format. So scan it to TIFF, save the TIFF file, and then produce a JPEG access copy. And I believe DHPSNY has information on its website about scanning information as well. And I'm seeing a question, which is better for archival storage of scanning and board digital documents, TIFF or PDFA? Again, it's one of those it depends questions. We actually, in our scanning guidelines for state agencies and local governments, we accept both. I would say that if it's something, if it's more of a textual document, I think PDFA is perfectly fine. If it's an image of an artwork or a map that has a lot of color, you might want to go with TIFF. From a storage perspective, PDFA files are quite a bit smaller than TIFF. That may also factor into, your decisions. See some people are typing. Yes, thank you, Jason. Yeah, I'm sorely tempted to go out and start pasting links into the chat box, but Adobe Connect, which is the service that uh, this webinar uses, crashed on me as I first logged in, and I'm a little hesitant to open up anything else on this computer at this moment. But I will say the New York State Archives website is www.archives.nysed, as in New York State Education Department.gov. And if you search our site for imaging guidelines, you will find them. Hey, Brianna. Um, if an institution has VHS tapes in its collection that may need to be digitized, um, there are some sources out there. Library of Congress is a good source. Okay. And Julia is asking, do you redigitize audio if your digital files are at risk of becoming inaccessible due to failure of the CD media, or do you work on preserving the digital files that were already created? So do you redigitize audio? Again, it's an it depends situation. If you're happy with the quality of the audio files, I would focus on getting those off of the CDs. Uh, Instead of converting them. If you're not happy with the quality of the files, then redigitizing them is certainly an option. Anything else anyone is wondering about? Oh, someone's typing. Okay. Questions relating to email? Incidentally, for Library of Congress digitization resources, in addition to digitalpreservation.gov, a couple of individual Library of Congress units, including the recorded sound collection, maintain on their own websites information about their digitization standards. I think just a Google search, Library of Congress, digitization standards, audio, digitization standards, video will take you there. Okay. Nathan is asking, are there handheld scanning wands? Is that a thing that exists? Yes, they do. In fact, we do have a wand scanner. It doesn't produce great copies, but for instances in which somebody is interested in a prison admission log, but is interested in only one inmate, we have these prison admission logs that are huge, oversized files. We will use the wand scanner to reproduce the entry for an individual prisoner, simply because the volumes are so large that they can't be put on a flatbed scanner. And putting it on an overhead scanner is a bit of a challenge, given that they just want they want the information for their great grandfather's admission to Clinton prison. In instances where okay, a book is old and fragile but not in special collections. Um, Nathan, are you asking whether patrons should be allowed to use handheld scanners? And while I wait for Nathan's reply, I just wanted to say, in those instances, because this was touched upon a little bit earlier, if we do have an oversized volume that can't easily be fit onto a flatbed scanner or an overhead scanner, there have been instances in which someone in our digitization unit will take a digital SLR camera and photograph the page. Okay. And while I wait for Nathan, I just wanted to highlight one of the resources and additional resources um, for conducting an inventory. Gretchen Guggen did a webinar a few years ago for the Association of Southeastern Research Libraries, in which she detailed how she went about inventorying the portable media that she found lurking in boxes of collections at the University of Virginia's Department of Special Collections. So if you know that you've got portable media hiding out amongst paper records in your holdings, Gretchen's PowerPoint presentation is a really helpful source of information. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Okay. I do know quite a few libraries do allow researchers to bring wand scanners or even flatbed scanners into their facilities. If they freely circulate on the stacks, it might be hard to restrict access to them. I can tell you, for instance, that the State Library, our sister institution, does allow people to bring in wand scanners, flatbed scanners. The archives does not, simply because of the rarity of our materials, and the manuscripts division of the State Library does not, for the very same reason. Um, if if you've got a situation in which materials that probably should be in special collections are sitting on the stacks, okay, then that might be more of a policy of trying to persuade the powers that be that rare materials, old materials really should be transferred to special collections. And as Michelle just pointed out in the chat, National Archives, Archives 2 facility in College Park does allow scanners. We allow people to bring in digital cameras. We don't allow the use of flash, and we don't allow the use of camera stands. But if they want to bring in their phone and take pictures, or if they want to bring in, any sort of digital camera, we allow that. But we don't allow scanners. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing things. I'm not seeing anybody typing. Should we wrap it up for the day?
That
Okay.
sounds good.
If any of you do have any questions that come to mind at some point, I often think of things at 3 o'clock in the morning and not necessarily when I should. If you have any questions about the content of this webinar, please feel free to get in touch with me. And if you have any questions about collection development policies, disaster response plans, anything else relating to DHPSNY's offerings or services, there's the contact information for DHPSNY. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We'll
Thank
talk
you,
to you soon.
Bonnie.
Goodbye, everybody.